Good evening. The time is now 7 o'clock. I'd like to call this meeting of the Beloit City Council to order. And before we take roll call, I would just like to share that item 11A on our agenda tonight will be removed. It'll be going to the Park, Recreation, Conservation Advisory Commission, and it should come before us on our October 18th meeting. With that being said, Mr. Clerk, can I get a roll call, please?
All councilors are present.
Thank you. Item 2 is Pledge of Allegiance. May we all stand at this time.
Item 3 is special orders of the day and announcements. Item 3A, proclamation declaring October 11, 2021 as Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Beloit.
And we have Ryan Greendeer, Representative Sarah Lemieux, and Darren Brinegar from the Ho-Chunk Nation here to accept the proclamation tonight.
The City of Beloit, Wisconsin official proclamation. Whereas Indigenous Peoples Day began in commemoration of over 500 years of survival and renewal of indigenous nations in the face of genocide, colonization, political, religious, and cultural repression. And whereas the Beloit City Council recognizes that the indigenous peoples of this hemisphere, that would later be known as the Americas, have lived on these lands since time immemorial. And the Beloit City Council recognizes that the fact that the city of Beloit is built upon the homelands of the indigenous people of this region. And whereas the city of Beloit values the many contributions made to our community through indigenous peoples' knowledge, labor, technology, science, philosophy, arts, land conservation techniques, along with deep spiritual cultural practice, help shape the character of the land known as Beloit. And whereas the city of Beloit will continue to support indigenous nations' social and environmental justice, religious freedom, and tribal sovereignty efforts. And whereas the city of Beloit honors our country's indigenous roots and correct history, and seeks with this celebration to bring greater understanding of diversity by inclusion of indigenous people's culture and voice to the table in the city of Beloit, Wisconsin. And whereas the city of Beloit will recognize the desire of all indigenous peoples representing all 574 tribal nations to celebrate the second Monday in October as Indigenous Peoples Day, with special attention to the Wisconsin's federally recognized tribal nations. Now, therefore, the President of the Beloit City Council does hereby proclaim October 11th, 2021 as Indigenous Peoples Day in the city of Beloit, presented this 4th day of October, 2021, signed Clinton Anderson, City Council President. Would you like to say a couple words?
Good evening. Representative Darren Brinegar of the Ho-Chunk Nation, District 3. Beloit is part of our district. We're really honored that you chose to do this in honor of the Native Americans in the state of Wisconsin and the United States. Beloit is our indigenous territory, and we're looking forward to being part of this community in the very near future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Item 3B is a proclamation recognizing October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
City of Beloit, Wisconsin official proclamation. Whereas Domestic Violence Awareness Month was launched nationwide in October 1987 as a way to connect and unite individuals and organizations working on domestic violence issues while raising awareness for those issues. And whereas domestic violence has affected members of our community and individuals throughout the world, many victims of this crime suffer in silence because they are afraid to seek help. And whereas 36.3% of Wisconsin women and 32.1% of Wisconsin men experience intimate partner physical violence, intimate partner rape, and or intimate partner stalking in their lifetimes. And whereas it is estimated that nationally more than 10 million people experience domestic violence every year. Domestic violence can consist of physical abuse, emotional, sexual, financial, or psychological abuse. It can also cause long-term trauma to individuals of every gender, sexual orientation, race, religion, culture, and socioeconomic status. And whereas the National Domestic Violence Hotline is a nonprofit organization that is confidential and free of cost, providing victims and survivors with life-saving tools and immediate support. Callers to this hotline, 1-800-799-SAFE, 7233, will reach highly trained advocates to offer compassionate support in more than 200 languages. And whereas ending domestic violence requires the leadership of survivors, the collaborative efforts of law enforcement, public health officials, and community members. Now, therefore, the President of the Beloit City Council does hereby proclaim the month of October as Domestic Violence Awareness Month, honoring domestic violence survivors and advocates, calling upon residents, law enforcement, and health officials to speak out against domestic violence, hold abusers accountable, and assist those who are or have been victims of domestic violence. Presented this 4th day of October, 2021, signed Clinton Anderson, City Council President.
Item 4 is public hearings. Item 4A, consideration of ordinance number 3723, amending the zoning district map from C1 Office District to PLI Public Lands and Institutions District for the property located at 657 Bluff Street. This is first reading.
Community Development Director Julie Christensen.
Jamison Geiger, on behalf of United Church of Beloit, submitted this application for a rezoning. They identified worship and church ministries as their principal uses and community ministries as their secondary use. The PLI district is a special purpose zoning classification that's intended to accommodate major public and quasi-public uses such as schools, religious institutions, community services, daycare centers, and libraries. Their purpose for requesting this rezoning, because their religious uses are allowed in the C1, is to ensure that their community ministry uses are clearly permitted by right. The PLI zoning would allow transitional living uses that are currently prohibited in the C1 district. At the Plan Commission meeting, Jamison Geiger spoke and said that the church has been a supporter and participant with Family Promise and serves as a day site at this point in time. He explained that they are a sponsoring congregation and they have residents stay at the building for a week at a time on a rotating basis. And he said the Family Promise would like to have a more fixed site and the church can accommodate 3 or 4 families with a maximum of 10 to 12 people. And they have a large enough parking lot and they're not planning on any building expansion. They want to be able to continue that ministry. Plan Commission did review this application on September 8th and voted unanimously to recommend approval of this zoning map amendment.
Thank you. And I'll also just make this note to the folks that received the proclamation. You're more than welcome to stay, but you do not have to stay here for the whole meeting. We will not be offended. At this time, the public hearing is now open. Would anyone wishing to speak in favor or opposed to this item come forward at this time? Second call. Third call. Public hearing is now closed. Do I have a motion to lay this item over?
Motion.
Motion by Duncan,
I'll second.
second by Vice President Keys. Any discussion? Not all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Item 4B, consideration of ordinance number 3724, amending the zoning district map from C1 Office District to PLI Public Lands and Institutions District for a portion of 1650 Lee Lane to become part of 2600 Milwaukee Road. This is first reading.
Community Development Director Julie Christensen.
So the land that is a subject to this request includes the track and field for Fruzen Intermediate School, which was constructed on land owned by Beloit Health System. They commissioned a platted survey to legally describe a 4.862 acre parcel that includes a track and field property so that it can be conveyed to the school district of Beloit. This platted survey was approved contingent upon this parcel being rezoned to PLI so that it can be attached to the adjacent Fruzen Intermediate School parcel at 2600 Milwaukee Road, which is already zoned PLI. Parcel A is not a standalone parcel, as a platted survey can only be used to convey property between adjacent owners. Planning Commission reviewed this application on September 8th and voted unanimously to recommend approval of this zoning map amendment.
Thank you. At this time, the public hearing is now open. Would anyone wishing to speak in favor or oppose this item come forward at this time? Second call? Third call? Public hearing is now closed. Do I have a motion to lay this item over? Motion by Levy, is there a second? Second by Forbeck. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Item 4C, consideration of ordinance number 3725, amending the zoning district map from R1B, single-family residential district, to R2, two-family residential district for the property located at 529 8th Street. This is first reading.
Community Development Director Julie Christensen.
Wilfredo and Jennifer Aldama recently purchased the property located at 529 East Street, and they would like to be able to use this existing structure as a two-family dwelling. This property lost its non-conforming status as a duplex more than a decade ago on July 11, 2011. I think a copy of the letter was included in the staff report. This property at this point may be used as a single-family dwelling, either rental or owner-occupied. The future land use map of the city's comprehensive plan recommends single-family residential use and zoning. Staff did advise the applicants before submittal that staff would be recommending denial of their application. They did also note at the Plan Commission meeting that they knew that before they purchased it. They just took a chance that they might get approval to use it as a two-family. And at this point, in this neighborhood, this was downzoned back in the late 90s, early 2000s, at the residents' request to try to have their neighborhood be single-family. There was a lot of carving up of properties over the years, and they really just wanted it to be a single-family neighborhood. That's why the whole area was downzoned, which is also why our comprehensive plan shows single-family uses. And so there aren't adjacent or nearby R2 properties with close to this property, and the property is perfectly suitable for single-family residential uses. And in the past, council has approved some incentives through our housing rehab loan program to allow for conversions. There's some forgivable portions. So at the meeting, Plan Commission did encourage the applicants, when they recommended denial, to seek that funding out. And so at the Plan Commission meeting, they did hold a public hearing, and then they did vote unanimously to recommend denial of the zoning map amendment.
Thank you. At this time, the public hearing is now open. Anyone wishing to speak in favor or oppose this item may come forward at this time. Second call. Third call. Public hearing is now closed. Can I have a motion to lay this item over?
I so move.
Motion by Forbeck. Second by Duncan. Any discussion? Yes, Counselor Preschel.
We haven't seen a case like this in quite a while, but Julie explained it very well, and it was gone over thoroughly at the Plan Commission meeting. I don't really have anything to add to what Julie said, but to say it's just something we as a council haven't seen in quite a while. It's less common these days than it was 10 or 15 years ago or more.
Thank you. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries.
Item 5 is public comment.
Reach a portion of the agenda where members of the public may speak before the council about any issues that we may have come before us in the future. Council may not act on any of these items, but we may refer a staff person to that item if needed. We ask that you refrain from any personal attacks and keep your comments to 3 minutes or less. This time, public comment is now open. Is there anyone wishing to speak at this time? Yes. And please state your name and address for the record, please.
My name is Michael Kochanski. My address is 1630 Turtle Street in Beloit. I understand that the city is to receive several $1 million in funds from the United States government, from the COVID situation. And I was just wondering, I wasn't able to be here last week, but I was wondering what the status or how that money is going to be divided and what the status of that discussion is.
What we'll do is we'll have a staff member reach out to you and give you some of the information. We also have that on YouTube, so.
Okay.
So we'll have a staff person reach out to you. I think our city manager just wrote out to reach out to you, so.
Great. Thank you.
Yep, no problem. Would anyone else wish to speak at this time? Second call? Third call? This time, public comment is now closed.
Item 6 is the consent agenda. All items listed under the consent agenda are considered routine and will be enacted by one motion. There will be no separate discussion of these items unless a council member so requests, in which event the item will be removed from the general order of business and considered at this point on the agenda.
Would any council member like any item removed from the consent agenda? If not, the consent agenda consists of items 6A through 6H. Do I have a motion to approve? Motion by Preschel, second by Forbeck. Any discussion? Not, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Item 7 is licenses. There are none. Item 8 is ordinances. There are none. Item 9 is appointments. There are none. Item 10, councilor activities and upcoming events.
Start with Vice President Keys tonight.
Thank you, Council President. I do not have a commission or committee report, but since our last council meeting, I've attended several events virtually and in person. I was able to attend the ARPA American Rescue Plan Council and Public Workshop, which was last Monday, and then I was able to view it again online. So on the YouTube channel, looking up Beloit City Council ARPA, I was able to watch that again today. So it is there for viewing. Last week, I was able to join the Beloit College cross-country teams in a plogging effort, and in less than an hour, the group got 26 bags of litter, and it was fantastic. And the enthusiasm of the students as they came back in was inspiring and exciting, and so I'm hopeful that we'll have continued community collaboration with those efforts. On September 30th, I attended the Greentown Rockford Region's pre-event webinar of Building Equitable and Sustainable Communities. It was very informative, and it's leading up to a larger regional conference on November 12th that is open to public and community leaders as well. And so encourage people to look into that. And then finally, I just want to share that the concerns and realities of COVID still persist and are here locally. And so please continue to take precautions, especially indoors, in public, to wear a mask, and when you're with people outside your home, socially distance, just to help keep yourself, your family, and community safe. So thank you, and that ends my report.
Thank you. Councilor Levy? No report. Councilor Blakely?
I just want to encourage everybody to get out to our Beloit businesses, both on the west and east side. Enjoy Big Hill Park. The colors are becoming magnificent. And when you are downtown, please be cautious driving, walking, or riding a scooter. I have heard from some residents that they're concerned about speed limits, the speed at which vehicles are traveling in the downtown area. So just make it safe for all of us and get out there and enjoy this beautiful month. Thank you.
Councilor Duncan?
Okay. Thank you, President Anderson. First, I want to mention the passing of two distinguished Beloit educators, Mrs. Sally Adams and Ralph Irvin. They made a lasting impact in the lives of so many children and families in Beloit and will truly be missed by our community. So let's all keep their families in our thoughts and prayers during this difficult time. Next, for my activities. I attended the 2021 Greater Beloit and State Line Chamber of Commerce Annual Influential Women in Business Luncheon, along with Councilor Forbeck and our city staff. I want to commend both Chambers of Commerce, Amy Thurner, and all of those who worked to make this event successful. I also want to give congratulations to the 3 local businesswomen who were recognized. They were as follows. The Next Gen Award went to Anna Montoya. The Role Model Award went to Roxanne Sosnowski, and the Executive Influencer was Jennifer First. I applaud each of them for their leadership, influence, and hard work. And I attended the Beloit Memorial High School Academy Steering Committee meeting. I had the opportunity to join a great team of stakeholders and School District of Beloit staff in creating and implementing the portrait of a Beloit Memorial High School graduate. This roadmap will help us to enhance our students and school district. I hope you will take a moment and view it on the School District of Beloit website. I also met with Danica Keaton, who is the new marketing director at Beloit Area Community Health Center, and I attended the Visit Beloit Board of Directors meeting. That said, I'll give an overview from that meeting. The Visit Beloit Board of Directors met on September 22nd at their new offices at 656 Pleasant Street in downtown Beloit. It was the first in-person meeting since January of 2020. The board reviewed the 2020 financial audit, which was a clean report, and indicated the organization continues to be positive stewards of its finances. They also reviewed the draft fiscal year 2022 budget, which is much stronger compared to the 2020 and 2021 budgets because of the recovery of the tourism industry post-COVID-19. An acknowledgement was made that the organization is one of approximately 200 tourism entities in the United States that have achieved the Destination Marketing Accreditation Program. By accomplishing this accreditation, it is proven that Visit Beloit is meeting the best practices, policies, and procedures of destination marketing organizations. Lastly, the new Director of Marketing and Public Relations, Tracy Bliss, was introduced. Tracy is a native to Beloit and brings years of marketing, advertising, and graphic design experience to the organization. In closing, I'll reiterate, with the latest COVID report on the Rock County Public Health website, which shows that Beloit has 122 more COVID cases since September 27th. I encourage residents to get the vaccine and take the necessary safety precautions to slow the spread of this virus. Everyone 12 and older is now eligible to get the vaccine. There is more information listed on our City of Beloit Facebook page. Also, please be careful driving through the construction areas, especially at the I-3990 and I-43 Wisconsin 81 interchange. For frequent updates, residents can go to the Wisconsin I-3990 project website. This ends my council report for this evening.
Thank you. Councilor Preschel?
I attended the Masonic Lodge Morning Stars 175th anniversary celebration a couple weeks ago. And I wanted to tell everybody I've been through I take photos, as everybody probably knows. And I can tell you that the 2 best weeks of fall colors are approaching next week and the week following, based on what's in my archives. It's a little warm this time of year still, so maybe it'll be a little delayed, but it does look like it's heading to a normal peak in that second week of October. It's always October 10/10 is always the date I remember for those peaks at Big Hill and stuff. And if anybody's wondering where to go to get those shots, just give me a call, contact me, I'll let you know. I'm happy to share the knowledge I've gained over many years of perusing this area. And so enjoy this month. It's the best month of the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilor Forbeck?
Yes. I'd like to mention again the Beloit College Powerhouse. Fast Company magazine just gave it its top award for the most innovative building in the world that opened in 2020. And obviously, my family is rather closely connected with this fabulous project, but I just want to pass on so all of us, again, can realize how impressive the excellence of this process was, of fabulous collaboration with Beloit College and the city and many, many others. And so, again, let's be really proud of this beautiful place. Okay, and then also I attended the SLATS meeting today where we okayed lots of money, never enough for repair of streets, but you know, it was positive, and these are really prepared people who get together all the time during those SLATS meetings, and they know what they're doing, and it's a long process to finally get a project underway. Thank you.
And oddly enough, I don't have a report tonight, so we'll go on to the next item.
Item 11 is city manager's presentations. There are none. Item 12, reports from boards and city officers. 12A, presentation of the proposed 2022 operating, library, and capital improvements budget.
Finance Director Eric Miller will change hats and start presenting.
Thank you and good evening. So we began the process nearly 5 months ago when we distributed and collected capital improvement request forms. That always kicks off our annual budget process, and since that time, we've met with department and division heads to go through the requests as well as their operating budgets line by line in order to present to you a proposed budget tonight. So the first slide here is the 2022 budget summary. The city's proposed budget for all funds, including the capital improvements budget, is just under $150 million, which is about $50 million higher than it was in 2021, or about 50%. The majority of this increase is related to the capital projects fund, specifically the capital project that is related to the wastewater treatment plant improvement project. The general fund budget is about $35 million, which is an increase of just over $1 million or 3.1% from last year's budget. And the enterprise funds combined are increasing $850,000 to just under $21 million. So this next slide is a breakdown of the total budget, which shows a high-level summary of changes by major fund type. More details on these particular funds will be presented later on in the presentation. And the capital improvement funds here, as I just mentioned, are driving the increase. You can see a $42 million. And then the special revenue funds are also making up a large portion of the increase. Special revenue funds are, of course, our TIF districts. There is a slight reduction in the debt service fund as well as internal service funds, which is bringing that down just a little bit. So some of the highlights that are in the 2022 budget as it relates to personnel. We did have 2 additional seasonal or casual employees that were added to the city payroll to staff the front desk here at City Hall. And we also did add 1 part-time administrative assistant position out at the engineering department. There's also 1 person proposed, a senior project engineer position, which is allocated to the engineering staff as well as other departments within the public works funds. And as always, we do have some minor changes that occur to allocations to existing employees that impact the general fund, enterprise funds, and the CDBG fund. So some other non-personnel related items in the budget. The big one, of course, is the net new construction number. That is 8.67% for this year's budget. It is by far the highest net new construction number that I've ever seen in my tenure here, and also in Rock County this year by far. So that's quite a proud achievement for the city of Beloit. Shared revenue and expenditure restraint continue to remain flat. It has been for well over a decade now. There are no projected increases or decreases to the highway aids. We had anticipated a slight increase in the highway aid based on the governor's approved budget, but the percentages just did not come in our favor, and so they are pretty flat for 2022. There was a personal property aid adjustment for 2022, which rectified an interpretation of the statutes as it related to the exemption of personal property. That did end up benefiting the city because there were 2 TIF districts that closed in the process of when this statute was enacted, and therefore they back paid some of the money that was due to us from that interpretation. The assessed values and equalized values have increased by about 8% and just over 22% respectively. Those are very significant increases compared to what we might normally see in the city. The municipal property tax levy increased by just over $1 million or 6%. 100,000 of that is attributed to debt service. And it's important to note that we still fall within strict levy limits in the state. They have been in place since 2005. There is no anticipation of those going away anytime soon from what I understand. One thing to note, debt service is exempt from levy limits. So some other highlights related to other revenue categories. Typically, we review user fees every year to make sure that they are properly reflecting the cost to provide those services. Many of those are impacting our park and rec programs. So there was some minimal adjusted program costs or fees. The Planning and Building Services Division did propose a number of increases in some permit fees, primarily related to HVAC, plumbing, and electrical permits. One of the bigger items is the proposed right-of-way fee, which is a new fee for the city, which is $50 for each permit, which also includes 50 cents per foot for underground utility installations. These are pretty common around the rest of the state. We just didn't have any, so we are catching up with everybody. In the utility funds, the wastewater utility is proposing a 4.5% increase. This was part of the original plan as it relates to the wastewater treatment plant upgrades that we had discussed even last year at this time. We also are proposing a 25-cent increase on the stormwater fee from $3.50 to $3.75. We have not had a stormwater fee increase since 2015. And we are also still in the process of a comprehensive water rate study that we don't have an estimate on when that will become effective yet due to some timing within the PSC, which is a state-run organization that keeps track of our water rates. And so there is a potential for implementing a simplified rate case prior to the implementation of the full rate case. That is yet to be determined. If it would be, simplified rate cases are generally 3% increases. So here we have the general fund revenues by type. You can see that the line item number 1, the taxes, are increasing by about $600,000. That is primarily due to the net new construction number that we were talking about earlier. By taking advantage of the levy limit situation that we fall under within the state. And so we want to capture all of that whenever we have the possibility to do so. So that is the driving force behind that particular line item in the general fund. Licenses and permits increased by about just over 50,000. Fines and forfeitures are actually down. This is due to lower municipal court fees. The personal property aid payment correction accounts for the majority of the intergovernmental aid and grants line item. As I mentioned, we did not see any other increases to expenditure restraint or shared revenue or any of our highway transportation aid. So that personal property aid adjustment is the driving factor there. The departmental earnings increase is related to the right-of-way permits that I just mentioned, and the other funding sources is related to fund balance that we are applying to help pay for the overall revaluation of the city through our assessor's office. This next slide is just a nice graphical representation of where the revenues are being distributed. And you can see that 56% of our revenues do come from intergovernmental state and federal aids. The next closest on the chart is taxes at 32%. So there's still a pretty sizable gap that separates the two funding sources within the general fund. So here is the general fund expenditures by type, or by department, I should say. The city manager's line item increased simply due to a change in insurance coverage. Going from single to family will do that. Insurance is expensive, and so we see that increasing by 23,000. IT fees increased due to new software maintenance fees as well as some additional consulting fees. The more we get into the technological age, the softwares that we use have annual maintenance costs that are associated with them, and so we have to increase those annual fees there. The HR budget is increased due to the two seasonal employees that I mentioned earlier on in the slide, as well as some consulting fees. The finance and admin budget increased due primarily to the assessment reval. The police and fire departments increased due to the vehicle replacement reserve being funded. And as far as the public works department, most of this is in the snow and ice removal budget. Commodity prices have increased pretty substantially since last year, which would include salt and fuel, as well as some contracted services expenses. We also did add some vehicle replacement reserve into the Public Works Department under the snow budget. So again, here is the pie chart related to the expenditures. Pretty typical allocation from what we've seen in past years, whereas police and fire make up 60% of the budget, which is pretty common around the state, and Public Works makes up nearly 20%. So we'll get into some of the other fund types. This is the special revenue funds. As I mentioned, special revenue funds are comprised of tax increment districts, grant funds, the library, and the solid waste fund. This had an increase of 40%. The tax increment district number 10 and number 13 were the two driving forces behind that increase, primarily TIF district number 10, which is where we saw the about double of the increment that was located out there, which created about double the budget from last year, and therefore they make up most of that difference in the special revenue funds. The proposed enterprise funds are made up of the golf course, cemetery, transit, our utilities, and the ambulance funds. As I mentioned before, this increased by just over 4%. We did have a proposed wastewater increase of 4.5%. I mentioned the comprehensive water rate study earlier. And we did receive some ARPA funds for the transit utility or transit fund as it relates to potential losses due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Those are separate items in a different part of the ARPA Act that are not associated with the allocation that the city received that we had done the public input session on last week. The proposed internal service funds actually showed a decrease from last year, and this is mostly due to the claims experience that we've seen over the last 2 years that we believe mostly is being driven by COVID-19. And so we've seen a steady decline in the amount of claims. However, in second half of 2021, we have seen that start to come back and level off a little bit, getting back to more normal type usage in our claim experience. So we'll continue to monitor that and see how we progress throughout the rest of 2021 and into 2022. The workers' compensation rate did increase slightly, very modestly. Our experience modification factor sits at 0.70. This is slightly higher than what we were at last year at 0.65. But either way, 0.7 is amazing. That means we are paying 70% of our premium rate. We get a 30% reduction in our premium rate. Just for reference, in 2018, that rate was at 1.22, meaning we were paying 122%. So that 122 was the highest I remember it being. Okay. The debt service fund did decrease slightly by about $50,000, just under 1%. As I mentioned before, general obligation debt service is exempt from the state-imposed levy limits, meaning that we have the ability to add debt service to the overall tax rate in the city without being limited. The overall general obligation debt service decreased, however, the portion that is paid for by the levy increased by $100,000. What that means is that other funding sources that paid portions of that general obligation debt fell off, which meant that we had to pick those up through the debt service levy. The 2022 proposed capital funds includes the capital improvement plan, the capital improvement CIP, engineering, equipment replacement, and computer replacement. So this, of course, as I mentioned earlier and a couple other times during the presentation, is really driven by the wastewater treatment plant upgrades project, which totals just over $4 million for the 2022, or $40 million, I'm sorry, for the 2022 budget. The funding sources for the capital improvement budget include GO bonds and notes, fund balance, special assessments. We are also going to the state for a clean water fund loan, which you saw a reimbursement resolution for, I believe, last meeting. And that is all related to the funding mechanism of the wastewater treatment plant upgrades. The total projects include $45 million of infrastructure, $2 million of capital equipment, and $2 million of buildings and grounds. So here is the first look at the proposed municipal tax levy. And what you can see here is the shift between the general fund and the transit fund. If you remember last year, we reduced the levy portion of the transit and moved that into the general fund. That was because transit did receive CARES Act money last year in order to help with operations. And so we did not need to levy those dollars to the transit authority. Therefore, that money is not available this year, so we had to move that back from the general fund portion and moved it back into the transit. That's why you see an increase of $512,000 going into the transit fund in 2022. What needs to be mentioned is that the overall tax levy is still governed by the municipal or the tax levy limits. Regardless of how those funds are shifted between the different line items within the levy, the total levy is what's governed by the levy limits. And so therefore, we have a total levy increase of just over $1 million, or that's 6.16%. We did have the $100,000 increase in the debt service fund portion of the levy, as well as $400,000 in the general fund portion of the levy. The tax rate is proposed to be at $12.37, which is an 80-cent increase over 2021's adopted levy. So what that would mean is that on an average home that costs $100,000, then that would increase the overall tax to that property by $80. And so if you divide that out by 12 months in a year, you're looking at about $6.60 a month. That's the overall impact on a monthly basis to that type of increase when you look at a property of that value. So it's just a baseline number to kind of keep in mind. I'd also like to point out the line item that is directly above the blue highlighted line, which is called the tax rate without TIF. And what you can see there is actually a reduction in the tax rate when you look at the rate without TIF. And you can see that it decreased by almost 17 cents per thousand of assessed value, or almost 2%. And so why that's important is because what that's telling us is that the assessed value growth outpaced the growth of the tax levy. And if we did not have any TIF districts located in the city, that would be the tax rate. But due to the increase in the increment values of all of our TIDs, which means they're very successful, and that's a good thing, then you have to levy a portion of the tax in order to fund the TIF. So it's important to see those two tax rates and distinguish between those two to understand what that could potentially mean when those TIF districts close. This gives you a really good indication of what your tax rate may look like under the existing conditions if the TID did not exist.
There's no way you can close those TIFs in the next month?
I would never say never.
It actually, if I may, all joking aside, it might be appropriate to take a moment to explain the timeline, because in fact, we do anticipate closing one of the TIFs prior to the end of this year. However, we won't capture that impact to the tax rate, or we don't have the opportunity to, I'm actually telling the story, until next year for budget 2023. So in answer to your question, Mark, yes, we could. It won't have any impact on the 2022 tax rate, but it absolutely would have an impact, I mean, at least within anything we can foresee. If the world as we know it looks anything at all like it does now, then it is absolutely reasonable to expect a decrease to the tax rate due both to that closure and to the reevaluation that's currently in place, which will redistribute and help those new developments at higher values capture more of their burden.
No, I only interrupted you because this is the thing that captured all the attention when I was reading through it, and this in the previous. And I wanted to think that, businesses do it all the time. They look ahead and they say, well, we can take a credit against that next year, blah, 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 and they can do all that. You're the finance guy. You know this better than anybody in the room. If there's any opportunity for us to do that in the next month or so to figure out a way to get the sticker shock out of this proposed budget, I'm all in favor of working it. I don't want to have that discussion tonight. I want to have it next Monday, but and then ongoing from there. But I want to challenge everybody and take this opportunity to. I know it's really hard. Believe me, there's nobody here that better understands how hard it is, except you and Lori. But we all understand how hard it is and the challenges that we face. But if there's any way you can pull that off, I'm going to challenge you guys to do it. I know it's a lot to ask, but I'm just going to. It's the only thing I'm going to say about it until we meet next Monday.
All right, sounds good. Thank you.
If I may, and I know we're not getting into the nitty-gritty detail tonight. We're trying to do a high-level overview and go into those details at the workshop on Monday. But what I was trying to explain, and perhaps not quite clearly enough, is that even with an immediate closure, even with the revaluation in process, we do not have the revenue to impact the 2022 tax rate. What I'm saying is that we're asking for some patience, which is hard, from our residents, and understanding that in order to capture the revenue allowed under the net new construction that we experienced this year, yes, 2022, the rate is as proposed. Clearly, if this is preliminary, this is the recommendation, this is not the adopted budget. But what I'm trying to do is manage expectations because we don't have the ability to close the TID that is the sizable one that will have the greatest impact. Even doing it immediately does not capture that revenue stream until budget 2023. That's simply the way the state statute works as far as how those revenues and expenses are managed. And I'll let the finance director speak to additional details. So I was attempting to manage expectations, knowing that 2022 is a bit of a difficult year, with the anticipation that 2023 should be significantly different. Again, with the caution of assuming everything in the world is similarly situated to how we are budgeting now. So with our reliance on the state budget restraints and constraints on both our revenues and our expenditures, we have very, very limited options. And so when we do see net new construction increases like we've seen, largely results of projects like Amazon, $100 million project has an impact on your community. So we have an opportunity to capture revenue when we have been significantly limited. And as you all know, in looking at the previous slides that Eric's presented, our revenues have been flat in every other way from the state, and our expenses do not stay flat. We experience inflation just like anyone else, and when 80% of our budget is personnel, we experience a higher rate of inflation than a typical business, so to speak. So in any case, that's all I'll say about that at this time, but I do think it's important to manage expectations, to understand what we're at least proposing for 2022, understanding that we should have far more options, more palatable options in 2023 and beyond.
And the thing I was saying about the challenges we face, one of the many is the way the state structures its spending restraints and the way that's operated and the catch-22 it presents. And I'm hoping to give you an opening to explain that a little bit tonight. Thank you.
Sure, and just to kind of build off of what the city manager was talking about in terms of flat revenue streams in the city, that is why we are in a position with some of our capital improvement programs that we are including equipment in our borrowing. Generally, we would want to reserve those dollars and pay cash for those so that we're not having to borrow and pay interest for 10 years on equipment. Those reductions in revenue, or what I should say is flat revenue streams, the non-ability to build additional revenues, has created a problem that we have eliminated the funding of vehicle replacement and computer replacement funds. So these are the types of things that we had mentioned in prior council workshops where we want to continue to take additional money. We want to find these additional revenue streams to build those reserves back up so that we don't have to continue to borrow long-term dollars on short-term equipment. That's just one example of many that we've faced over the last decade plus, really, ever since the Great Recession hit in 2008. We've been dealing with these issues. So when we have an opportunity to take advantage of what the state has put before us in terms of net new construction, that's why we must do that and capture all of that we can in order to continue to build the base that we desperately need in order to continue growing into the future. So that's just, again, one example. Another item that I just want to touch on quickly in terms of the TIF is that by statute, you have to certify the TIF districts each and every year. You have to do that by April 15 of every year. So in 2021, we would have had to have made a decision on whether we were going to keep open or close any of our TIF. But we recertified those. We're going to receive increment in 2022. That way we're kind of stuck in terms of the tax rate because we have to levy those dollars. We've already certified with the state that that's what we're going to do, so we have to do that. So that's what makes it difficult and hard to explain that this year is going to be a little bit tougher of a year. However, between now and April 15 of 2022, if we file the closing resolution on the TIF districts, that's when those would come off of the roll, and you would see an exceptional reduction, potentially, of the tax rate in 2022 payable 2023.
We're nearing the end of a long road of development that's been all for the good.
Yes.
We're just not quite there yet. And I remember in your
We just
presentation.
have to hold on one more year.
A couple months ago, your presentation explained that it was going to be April 22 when we see those.
Yep.
And, so I'm just still out there thinking there's some trick of financial brilliance we can come up with that'll save a little this year too. So anyway, thank you for.
Sure, no problem, of course. And so this slide just shows exactly what we just got done talking about, is our tax rate. And this shows a 5-year history of that tax rate. And I think it's important to note when you look at what the difference between what the 2021 payable 22 rate is versus that 2017, 2018 rate, you're looking at about 96 cents difference over a span of 4 to 5 years. So when you average that out, we generally keep our levy pretty flat, about 20 to 25 cents per thousand. It just so happens that the distribution of that has shifted more in 1 year than we're normally used to, but traditionally it's held pretty flat. I even looked back at the prior 5 years prior to this, and it's very consistent the same way, within a penny or two of that average 22 to 24 cents per thousand on an annual basis. So again, we are pretty consistent in our tax rate traditionally. And this slide also kind of jumps off the page when you look at where we are in terms of equalized value and assessed values. And that gap that you continue to see growing between the assessed and the equalized values is exactly what the reval is intended to do. It's intended to capture that additional growth and right-size those so that they're closer in line together instead of having that huge gap. The assessed values are values that are done by the local assessor. The equalized values are values that are done by the state. Those are done each year by the state. And they also have an impact on our overall borrowing capacity, as well as the increment located in our TIF districts are all based on equalized values. So what are the next steps in the budget process? A week from today, we're going to be at the library having a budget discussion, more in-depth discussion. We'll go through each of the divisions and departments one by one to make sure that all questions have been answered. The next step after that is going to be 2 weeks from tonight, right here on October 18th. That is the public hearing. That gives the public an opportunity to speak on the budget. And then 2 weeks after that, we'll bring it back to you on November 1st for your consideration for adoption. And that is my presentation. You're welcome. Thanks. That's okay. Thank you.
You've got 2 jobs.
Are there any other questions or comments for Eric at this time?
Yes.
Yes, Councilor Blakely.
Eric, in the proposed general fund expenditures, I was curious about the change in numbers for economic development. Could you just make a brief comment from the high-level overview perspective that we're going for here? You know what I'm saying?
Sure,
'Cause-
yeah. So
Okay.
that line item shows a decrease of about $17,000 in the economic development line item. That's the operating budget related to economic development. A lot of that is related to the changing of personnel who used to be in there and who's in there now, and what their options for insurance and whatnot are. So it's generally a pretty small operating budget, and that's why sometimes a minor change in the operations can have a pretty decent size impact.
Thanks very much.
Sure, you're welcome.
Yes, City Manager Luther.
Just very quickly, I wanted to let the public know that this presentation in its entirety is going to be available on the city's website tomorrow. So all of this information in the PowerPoint is available for viewing. And then also this presentation itself is recorded and is available on the internet as well. So you can rewatch or just take a look at the hard copy materials if you wish, and the budget as recommended. All, how many pages this year?
Oh, boy, yeah, I was going to say maybe
Even
300 to
400?
400.
Okay. The budget in its entirety, though it may take you a moment to download, is also available on the city's website. So all of those documents are fully available to be reviewed. Thank you.
Thank you. Counselor Duncan?
Yeah, we talked about this earlier, Eric. Could you just share the time frame from the last time we had an increase for our residents?
Sure. Yeah, so one of the slides in here indicates the overall tax rates over the last 5 years. So we generally see an increase in rates, but generally not this size of an increase. So they're normally pretty flat. And one thing I'd like to point out actually here on this slide is you can see in the 2018-2019 year, that reduction in the tax rate, that was a TID closure, just FYI. So when we closed TID number 5, that was the impact of TID number 5. So, but yeah, so from an increase in the resident standpoint, we do generally have an increase, just not to this size.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? I got a couple, so don't leave yet. You answered most of them. I think it's really good that you're kind of giving a surface level explanation. And a lot of residents, they see the levy and they kind of freak out, or they see the budget size and they're suddenly like, oh my God, what is this? So appreciate you explaining it. Can you just for the residents too, can you kind of explain the levy limits and what that is? Because I think they're probably wondering what is that and what is that doing to my taxes?
Yep, sure. So we fall under levy limits, which are imposed by the state, which means that we can only increase our overall levy by either two things. One is net new construction or zero. That's pretty much your options. And so whenever we see our net new construction increase by a sizable amount, that's why we get excited and we have to take advantage of that, because you don't get it that often. And so when we average roughly 1 to 1.5% net new construction on an annual basis, when you see 8.67, it does jump off the page. So and what that means is we don't have the ability to control our levy and our revenues as we wish. We rely on how much construction or net new construction occurs in the city on an annual basis. So we just don't have the freedoms to be able to increase if we're running short in an operating budget to just increase it. We're constrained by these levy limits. And on the flip side, as to what Councilor Preschel was mentioning earlier, we also fall under what's called expenditure restraint, which means that it's great for you if you have these projects, but you better not spend too much or else you're going to be penalized by state aids. And so there's a balancing act that we have to maintain in order to still achieve expenditure restraint payment, which for the city is around $600,000 a year, and the net new construction number when you do have increases in your overall levy. So we have to monitor both of those things as we put together a budget each year.
Council President Anderson, if I may. The other issue with the state levy limits is that you don't have the option to use a portion of that levy this year and a portion next year. We can only capture that net new construction dollar in this given budget year. So you can't use part of it and then save that capacity and use that capacity later. The capacity is limited. And so because again, it is so infrequent to have a net new construction number the size that we have this year, which is largely due to a $100 million investment that Amazon made, that they would not have made, I'm quite certain, but for the fact that that business park was in existence with all of the services provided to it from water and sewer, et cetera, and we were ready to help them begin construction in a very short time period. So all of those investments that the city made over time definitely have paid off. But we are also limited in our ability and the timing of how you are able to capture those revenues. And it is literally a use it or lose it scenario. And given, frankly, the inadequate funding that has been provided to the city for decades, this is really an opportunity that I don't think we can afford. My professional recommendation is that we cannot afford to miss out on this opportunity, because we have been making decisions in our budgets that we know don't apply to best budgeting principles. It doesn't make sense, as Eric said, logically to borrow for equipment that isn't going to exceed a 10-year life. But we have run out of options. And so we recognize that this is an impact, but the recommended budget is presented as it is in order to take advantage of that revenue stream that is currently available and that cannot be recaptured in future years.
I think it's important to note too that it's base building. And so these increases become part of your base. And so if you leave those off of your base, you're leaving behind a certain portion that you won't be able to recapture. Yeah, so you want to make sure that you get those base building net new construction numbers up there, so that as next year's net new construction comes in and builds on that base even further, then you haven't left money essentially on the table.
And that was what I was referring to before. We've waited a long time. If you look at the Gateway, it's been 20 years as a TIF, and, we're about to realize that vision that was there 20-plus years ago, but we're still not quite ready. We're not quite there.
Why do you say we're not quite there?
Because it's next year.
Oh,
And even so, some of the new construction you see in the non-TIF areas, there's still a delay. I mean, you see the building of the new apartments and new houses and stuff. Even though they might become occupied this week, that won't affect next year's taxes. There's still a delay. It takes, I think you said once, about 2 years before it really
Generally,
hits your
yep.
tax base.
Yep.
So there's always that perception is ahead of the gain that we get from it, regardless of the type of construction, or even
Right.
TIFs for that matter.
Yep, assessed
There's
value
about a
is
2 year.
based on, as of January 1 of every year. So if you begin construction or finish construction sometime early in the year, the value of that property is still what it was as of January 1. So you don't recognize that value until January 1 of the following year, which means that you're doing a budget at the end of that year for the following year. So as Mark indicated, it generally is about a 2-year span when you have new construction. So it does take a while.
And I wanted to point that out because people see it and they become used to it. It's been there for 9 months now, and yet we're doing the budget for next year and it doesn't count.
Right.
Well,
And-
right,
and-
but
yeah,
I'm sure
but
that
that's
our
something.
public
peop-
is able to understand when we explain this.
Yep.
City Manager Luther?
And as Eric was also saying, we're getting hit on both ends. So we're getting hit on the revenue side, and then we're also getting hit on the expenditure restraint side. So again, if we don't capture the allowable revenue to add to our expenses for 2022, we do not get that capacity back. And that's what's really hitting us hard on both ends, is that we have those limitations. And so I just wanted to reiterate that one more time. Because we are able to only impact that increase and grab that capacity, if you will, now. And so it does impact not just the 2022 budget, but every budget thereafter in regard to expenditure restraint.
Counselor Duncan?
President Anderson, did you want to go first? Or
No, it's been covered.
Oh, okay. This is another question that I asked Eric earlier, and just if he could just clarify. This is, some in the community may say, why are we not seeking grants? And then we just got those ARPA dollars. So could you clarify exactly how that works and what we've been doing as a city?
Sure. So the ARPA dollars that we were allocated do not have anything to do with our operating budget. Those cannot be used for operating expenditures. We are going to use those for one-time expenditures. Those would be infrastructure type projects, generally not operating because they are one-time use, and we don't want to include one-time dollars into a budget and then be stuck having to try to figure out a way on how to fund those one-time, or those future expenditures when we don't have a funding stream. And so that's why we always preach the sustainability concept in the economic sustainability side of things, so that we aren't expending one-time dollars on long life programs.
You said we have attained some grants.
We have, yep. We apply for grants all the time. I believe that we brought an application to council just recently about attaining a grant for the fire department. We also have grants in the police department for our beat patrol grants. We also have, we have lots of grants. We apply for grants. We also are part of our CDBG program, our home program. Those are all grant-funded programs through the federal government. So we definitely take advantage of grant opportunities in the city.
Another recent grant was the $100,000 that the city received to partner with both Beloit Area Community Health and with Community Action to provide vaccine clinics to homebound individuals. We also took the vaccine clinics on the road to area churches and other locations. So those are dollars that can supplement work that we would not otherwise have had previously budgeted. So that was an expansion of services, if you will, that those grant dollars were used for, but not a replacement for the operating budget that it still takes to run a city government.
Thank you. Any other discussion from council?
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Just put your other hat on real quick.
Yeah, real quick. Item 13 is adjournment.
We have a motion to
I
adjourn.
make a motion to adjourn.
Counselor Duncan, second by Forback. Any discussion? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. We're now adjourned. Thank you, everybody.